Just before midnight on December the 10th, 2010, a 28-year-old man called Aaron Shearhorn was chased to the door of Club Blur, a nightclub in Houston, Texas. Shearhorn was screaming for help. He had been stabbed. As Shearhorn tried to get in through the door, his pursuer caught up with him and stabbed him again. Shearhorn then ran to the car park, but his assailant caught up with him yet again, this time stabbing him multiple times until he collapsed. The assailant then made eye contact with one of the many witnesses at the scene and walked off. In a subsequent lineup, no less than 6 eyewitnesses independently identified a man called Lydell Grant as being the murderer. One of the eyewitnesses said that his face was burned into her memory. Another was reported to have identified him without any doubt or hesitation. All 6 eyewitnesses testified in court that he was the murderer, and as a result of this, Lydell Grant was sentenced to life in prison in 2012. In 2018, the Innocence Project of Texas reviewed the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene from under the victim's fingernails and concluded that it actually matched another man, Jamarico Carter. Carter was arrested and confessed to being the killer. He also confirmed that Lydell Grant had nothing to do with the crime. Grant was released in 2019 and his conviction overturned. So, here's a case where 6 independent eyewitnesses all identified the wrong person, and an innocent man spent years in prison as a result. How could this possibly happen? For a start, Lydell Grant and the actual murderer don't even look that similar. And yet, many of the eyewitnesses were very confident in their identification. In this episode, we're going to look at some of the reasons why eyewitness memory might not be as reliable as people tend to believe, even if eyewitnesses are highly confident of their own judgment when testifying in court. Despite advances in forensic science, many people are convicted solely on the basis of eyewitness testimony. This means that it's absolutely crucial that we understand how eyewitness memory operates and how reliable it is. This is one of those things where some criminal justice professionals, such as judges, argue that how eyewitness memory operates is essentially common sense, and so referring to behavioral science research has little value. Are they right? Well, let's look at one out of the many studies that have directly addressed this question. John Brigham and Robert Bothwell from Florida State University gave participants descriptions of real research studies in which people saw a simulated crime and were then asked to pick out the criminal from a lineup. The participants were asked to predict what percentage of the people in the study would be able to correctly identify the criminal. The activity we had just before this video was actually a replication of part of this experiment. Now let's look at the results. The results from the study, which the activity just before this video was based on, is labelled Study 1 in this graph. For this study, participants on average predicted that eyewitness accuracy would be 70.6%. That is, about 71 out of 100 eyewitnesses were expected to be able to identify the thief in the photographic lineup they were shown directly afterwards. However, if we look at the results obtained when this study was actually conducted, the accuracy rate was found to be only 12.5%. That is, in reality, only 13 out of 100 eyewitnesses could successfully pick out the thief from the lineup. Remember that there were only 6 photographs used in the lineup, so if someone guessed who the thief was at random, they should get it right about 17% of the time, 1 in 6. That is, the eyewitnesses were worse than chance. It's as if they hadn't even seen the thief at all. Brigham and Bothwell did the same thing for a number of other experiments, including the results we've labelled here as Study 2 and Study 3. The difference between how good people thought the eyewitnesses would be and how good they actually were was substantial in every comparison. As you can see, people estimated identification accuracy to be between 51 and 71%. However, the actual accuracy of participants was always significantly and substantially lower. So, the common sense beliefs of these participants, who we can regard as essentially potential jurors, were not true. In most cases, they weren't even close. The problem with these beliefs is that they influence how much credibility both criminal justice professionals and jurors assign to eyewitness testimony. This, of course, is reflected in the case of Lydell Grant, where he was convicted on the basis of 6 independent eyewitnesses, all of whom were proven to be wrong. Typically, people think of remembering an event as analogous to playing back a video in their heads. However, research suggests that memory retrieval is more of a creative, reconstructive process. To give one example, following the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center in New York in 2001, President George W. Bush came under scrutiny for misremembering key details about how he came to know about the attacks. He stated that he saw video footage of the first plane striking the first tower on the 11th of September, when this footage actually didn't emerge until a whole day after. Many saw this as evidence of lying, or even that the government was behind the attacks and the president was admitting having seen the footage in advance. However, Kathy Pesdek ran a study in which she asked an American sample about whether they had seen the footage of the first plane hitting the first tower on the 11th of September. Here's her findings. First, Hawaii, which is about as far as you can get from New York while still being in the US. Over there, 84% gave the wrong answer. Next was California, which is a little closer to New York, but still on the opposite side of the continent. Over there, things were a little better. Only 61% gave the wrong answer. What about New Yorkers? Surely they would know what they had seen. In fact, 76% of New Yorkers made the very same mistake that Bush made. In addition to this, across the entire sample, those who incorrectly answered yes were more confident in their answers than those who answered no. That is, those who were more confident were more likely to be wrong. This is a particularly important point, as we'll find out in episode 3, as confidence is the main cue that people use to judge the accuracy of an eyewitness on the assumption that more confident people are more accurate. One explanation for Bush's error suggested by researchers involves the act of remembering as being a process of narrative construction. This is the idea that when constructing a narrative account of an event, people sometimes reconstruct gaps in the story based on a script. That is, a general idea of what usually happens in a situation. Bush would have seen video footage on September the 11th at the school he was visiting when he heard of the attacks, but it wasn't of the first plane striking the first tower, it was of the aftermath of the crash. Daniel Greenberg of Duke University argues, after seeing the footage of the crash the next day, he may have incorporated it into the video he saw in the school, completing the story by adding cause to effect. In the few seconds or so it took him to formulate an answer to the question, this story may have sounded reasonable enough. There was footage after all. People do tend to learn these things from TV, and he was watching TV that morning. Greenberg also notes the tentativeness of Bush's accounts. He starts by discussing the second attack, only to interrupt himself and talk about the first. When he does talk about the first crash, he backtracks, making statements like, the TV was obviously on. Such hesitations and revisions create the impression that the president is reasoning out, perhaps reconstructing it as he goes. So, Bush seems to be off the hook. There's no need to look to conspiracy theories or deliberate lying to understand his mistakes. He's making eyewitness memory errors, but exactly the same errors that most other people made. This is despite the particularly shocking nature of this crime, the sort of crime that we would expect to be unforgettable. And while the errors did not directly affect the crime investigation in this case, it's not hard to imagine how such errors where most people are reporting seeing something a whole day before they actually saw it, might have serious consequences if that information was pivotal to solving a crime. This example illustrates a number of the misconceptions that people have about how eyewitness memory operates. First, eyewitness memory is a lot less accurate than people expect it to be. Second, retrieving memories of an event is not like passively playing back a video of the event. Memory retrieval is a creative, constructive process which makes it vulnerable to errors such as narrative reconstruction, as well as other issues that we'll visit later. Third, people's confidence in the accuracy of their own memories is unreliable. In fact, in Kathy Pesdeck's data, the more confident participants were, the less likely they were to be correct. That is, people seem to lack insight into the accuracy of their own memories. Next, we'll look at how memory works, how false memories can be created, and what we can do to try and deal with the problems of eyewitness memory.